Persuading people to take the actions we want can be hard. Our teams and clients are bombarded with thousands of messages every single day. But there is a way for you to get above the noise. Stories. This is the Stories with Traction podcast, and I'm your host, Matt Zaun. Join my guests and me as we unpack the power of storytelling. We'll talk about topics like leadership, sales, and marketing, all through the lens of strategic storytelling. Enjoy this episode. Today, we're going to talk about two fun topics: football and business. I'm joined by Will Baggett, who is the co-founder of Monetize Your Message. He is an international keynote speaker on leadership and soft skills, and he has quite the experience when it comes to football. Welcome to the show, Will.
Thanks for the opportunity, Matt. Really looking forward to diving into these super fun topics, and I just can't wait to engage with your audience.
So I appreciate your time, and I'm very interested and fascinated to kind of unpack elements of your journey thus far. So let's start with the football piece to your journey. So you have quite the experience when it comes to football, not as what some may think, not as an athlete, but someone that is helping the athletes and someone from the business perspective of football. So can you dive into that?
Yeah, absolutely, man. So I wasn't an athlete. I'm what you call a mathlete more than anything. And so, like you mentioned, I never once played any organized football. So no middle school, no high school, no college or anything. And I'll get this. I didn't mention this pre-show, but I didn't watch my first college football game until 2008 as a freshman in college.
Wow.
That was the first time I've ever saw a college football game. So we just didn't grow up. I just didn't grow up in that kind of house. My parents and my family they weren't really into football. And so somehow I just kind of fell into it. I started my college career at Mississippi State University and went to my first game. I fell in love with it. And so the way that kind of transpired in terms of how my football career developed, I went from Mississippi State. I transferred to Ole Miss. I finished there. And I actually never worked with college football there. I worked with Olympic sports. I did things with cheerleading and women's basketball, what have you. But it wasn't until I got to Baylor University in 2012 when life just changed for me from a football aspect. So the first thing I was able to land was a grad assistantship with the American Football Coaches Association, which is the biggest organization for coaches, high school through pro in the United States of America. So about 12,000 strong. So walking into it, I didn't know the organization existed. I just needed someone to pay for my grad degree at Baylor so I could, get my education. But getting into it, it was the absolute best experience ever. And I go from 6 months prior, I was working at Walmart while I was in college, to basically escorting Nick Saban around convention center halls and talking to him, and Mac Brown and Mark Richt. And it was just an amazing transformation. But I'm going to think back to my first week at Baylor. It was August of 2012. And I had a mentor who worked for the Kansas City Chiefs. His name was Jamil Northcutt. He said, "Hey, when you get to Baylor, connect with this guy named Kaz Kazadi. He's the head strength coach for football." I said, "Okay, I'll go and say hello." And by this time, I'd made my mind up. I was switching from strength to the business side, and I wasn't looking back. So I set up a meeting with him. I walk into his office, white polo, khaki pants. I'll never forget it. And I sit down for a couple minutes. He says, "You're Will, right?" I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "I heard you used to coach." I said, "Yes, sir, but I'm switching over to the business side." He said, "Sit right there." Went outside, yelled "squad up" in the loudest booming voice I'd ever heard. And 15 people rushed into the office, like hurrying there. And I realized I was in somebody's seat. So I popped up really quick. And he was like, "All right, Coach Thrill, tell them how you're going to be our new strength coach starting tomorrow at 5 a.m. What? I never said that. He says, "Tell them how you're going to be our new black shirt." And black shirt was kind of like glorified intern. I said, "I guess I'll see you guys tomorrow." And a guy handed me a pair of black shorts and said, "Don't be late." And that was how I got started in football strength and conditioning at Baylor University.
Wow.
And it was an amazing time. So that was 2012 to 2014. We won 2 Big 12 championships. We shared one with TCU, obviously. That's when we were dropping 70 on everybody. And it was so much fun. So take that experience. I went to the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl as an intern after that. Spent some time at ING in licensing. And then I went to the college football playoff for 3 years as a part of the as an operations specialist. I worked with the Secret Service, the President of the United States. I had 2 presidential visits. We can dive into that later. That was an experience. And then I did the 2022 Super Bowl in LA that the Los Angeles Rams won, which was an amazing experience. So yeah, I've seen every aspect of it. And even to this day, I actually still coach strength and conditioning for football. So I go to TCU twice a week and I still coach. It keeps me relevant. It keeps me just abreast of what the student athletes are talking about, what they care about. And so I can better tailor my messages to that end when I go and speak to them.
Wow. Okay. All right. So there's a lot to unpack with what you just said. All right. So one of the things that I want to get a little bit more clarity on is I'm fascinated when you said in 2008 you saw your first college football game, because it's later in life, right? So someone like myself, I grew up in a football home. Like everyone in my family played football. I grew up watching football. So it was almost through like habit that I loved football, so to speak. When did you fall in love? Like, was there a moment where you're like, what was I missing out on my whole life? Like, why didn't I do this or get involved sooner? Was there a moment that
Yeah.
like flipped the switch for you?
Yeah, I think it's the camaraderie of the game. And so when you're in a college football stadium, say, 60,000 plus people at the average SEC stadium, I think between 60 and 110,000 is kind of like the range for SEC. And when you see people in there all under kind of the same roof and they are focused on either team A or team B, rarely in any other aspects of life can you get people to agree on A or B, right? It's usually a C, D, A, E, F, G. And so you're connecting with people whom you may never talk to in like everyday life. You're turning around high-fiving people and they score a touchdown to some guy or some person that you may never come across, in just your everyday life. And so I think just the power that sports has to connect people from different walks of life. And seeing that live, I think that was really, shifted the game for me. But even when I got into the coaching aspect, just seeing players develop over time, seeing what it did for players and taking them out of some adverse situations, putting in some structured environments, helping them see a different way of life and giving them an opportunity to change their family trajectory. So I think it was kind of like a conglomerate, or I guess kind of a combination of a few different things. And obviously, when I was at AFCA, being able to just, be around these big time, coaches like, Dabo and David Shaw and Bill Snyder. And, I'll never forget this. Mac Brown was actually the president of AFCA my first year. And he was so nice to me, man. He actually wrote me a handwritten thank you note in his own handwriting. But he also talked about when he was growing up, he used to wash garbage trucks for $35 a pop to help make ends meet. And so just the stories behind the stories, the things that you don't hear on media day, I think that those things are what helped me fall in love with the game.
Wow, that's awesome. I appreciate you sharing that.
Yes,
So
sir.
you also mentioned the Rams Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
So little story for you. So I had a speaking engagement 2 days after the Super Bowl. Okay. And in LA. So I flew into LAX. And of course, there's a day after the Super Bowl that I landed, and I flew into LAX. I'm like, I got to check out the stadium. I knew it was over, but of course they're going to still have stuff up. So I drove over there, and it was kind of like the storm had already taken place with all the people and what goes into it. And I pull up, and I'm literally the only one there. I actually have pictures of this where I'm walking around not only the perimeter of the stadium, but I actually walk into the stadium, and there's all these different construction workers tearing down stuff, and there's scaffolding, everything. And so one of my business mentors told me years ago, he said, just walk with confidence wherever you go, and people will just let you do what you want. So I was walking up to someone. I was like, hey, do you mind if I take a picture over here? Hey, do you mind if I check this out? And I was able to like go into the stadium. It was such a surreal, cool experience. And of course, I wasn't there, but it was really neat to see the stadium, see all that goes into it, all the displays. It is quite the show. And I want to talk about that aspect of it, the business aspect. And here's why I think this is so important. There's so many business leaders that I work with that they get stuck in their own worlds. They get stuck in their own little bubbles where they're reading business books. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with reading, biographies of successful business people and learning about business from business people. But one of the things that I have found fascinating over the years is I've learned more about business from different worlds outside of business, two of which are athletics and music. Learning about athletics as far as the business aspect and music has been unbelievable for me growing my business. For this conversation, obviously, we'll focus on the athletic piece, but football is a business, right? Like it is a business through and through. So let's talk about that. What are some of the things that business leaders can learn and gain from understanding elements of the football business?
I would say the biggest thing is understanding that if you look at any major university, football is the cash cow. It drives the bus, it drives the ship. So I think that lesson from a transferable skill standpoint, I would say keep the main thing. So whatever is driving the bus, whatever is, keeping the lights on, sometimes we can get bogged down and focus on things that don't really matter as much or are not going to really affect the bottom line as much. But football, athletic universities, they know that if football is not going in the right direction, then the university goes in a separate direction. So you see a lot of transitions and hirings and firings. But also sports in general is a microcosm of society. It typically is a microcosm. It typically mirrors where society is going. And you mentioned music. My brother's actually a musician. And so I've learned more about that than I've cared to learn about that in the past few years. But it's been very interesting to see that. I would say also from the sports aspect, particularly in football, is the developmental aspect of really developing your players. And so whether it's like a scouting report, you're scouting your players, you have week to week, you have a team you're preparing for, you're watching tape on them, you know what they're doing. And so from a business aspect, what are your competitors up to? What are they selling? What kind of quarter did they have last quarter, and being able to be mindful of that. Secondly, we're constantly developing our people. And so we would play on Saturday. On Sunday, we would heavy squat our players. While most people are at home chilling, recovering, we're putting them in the squat rack and continuing to develop them and to keep the pressure on and giving them a healthy level of what we call co-opetition, right? Creating that internal competition that makes everyone better. And we would also do this thing in the weight room. We call them rack daddies. And so we would assign leaders to each rack. So you got the running backs here, you got the wide receivers here. We would pick one of them, they call the money guys, and they would be in charge of making sure that rack is always going well, that guys are always getting their hips down and guys are always squatting correctly. And so I think from, again, business aspect, developing your people, understanding who your A players are and how to put them in a position to be successful. And then also the acknowledgement. We would make sure we publicly recognize our players for doing well. And I think that's a huge thing, especially in the future of work. I do a lot of research in the future of work. And if you bog everything down to, what the future is, people want to be, they want to be acknowledged for their work. They want to be flexible. They want to be cared about beyond their paycheck. And so I think the same thing applies from a coaching standpoint and also just a football standpoint in general.
Wow, a lot of wisdom with what you just said. So I want to highlight one thing, and then I have a question for you with something that you had mentioned. So I really want to highlight the keep the main thing the main thing. There's a ton of wisdom in that, a ton of wisdom. It's funny that you mentioned that. Several months ago, I had a gentleman on this podcast. His name's Josh Rudiger, who was able to build the #1 podcast in the world. I was on the list of podcasts in the world. I believe it lasted 4 weeks on that list. I mean, unbelievably successful. So imagine, 3 million podcasts, he hit #1 for 4 weeks. So I had him on, and we were going through, how in the world did you do that? And he said something very similar to what you said. He basically talked about when you find something that works, you literally hit it as hard as you possibly can. And one of the things that he had mentioned was he actually studies generals. Okay, so Josh, who's a big history buff. And one of the things that he said was, when you look at all the successful generals through history, once they go through one of the lines, so say that they're doing really good on the right side, okay, a lot of people would say, all right, you're doing well on the right, now send people to the left. And he says, no, that's not what great generals do. When they find that they can go through the hole on the right, they send as much as they possibly can, because that's where they're having success. And he went into this whole analysis on how they were able to focus so deeply on that main thing. So when you said that to me about, football is a cash cow across the US. So what works, you got to make it work for you. A lot of businesses lose sight of that. A lot of businesses, once they find something that works, they stretch themselves so thin and they lose sight of what they were really good at. So I very much appreciate you mentioning that well. one of the things I do want some clarity on, and I want you to really speak to, because I think it's good in every aspect of life, not just athletics, but definitely business as well, is a couple of years ago, I can't pinpoint who wrote this article. It's been years now, but I did read an article. I believe it was on Michael Phelps, and one of his trainers was talking about how to be at the peak of success when it comes to athletics, you need to know how to turn it on and how to turn it off. And he said a lot of athletes struggle with turning it off. So they destroy their bodies or they get injuries, and it could potentially ruin their careers. And I know in business, sometimes I'm speaking to myself with this. Sometimes I could obsess over things and I can't shut my mind off. It's been detrimental to my sleep patterns. I'm up, this morning I was up at 4 o'clock in the morning, right? I couldn't turn it off. So could you give any advice to people that they want to do well in business, but is there any techniques that you can say to them? Like, you got to learn how to turn it off and rest as well, so you don't burn yourself out.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll kind of analogize it to the weight room and strength and conditioning. And so what we would do with our players, a lot of people think that in the football weight rooms, whether it be Division I or professional, that we do these crazy lifts and things you've never seen before. Like we got guys hanging upside down doing curls. It's not that. We have 3 core lifts that we will do. It's a bench, it's a squat, and it's a deadlift. And everything is a variation of those 3 core lifts. And that's pretty much what we do. We stay inside that realm. And so when it comes to the rest and recovery aspect, one thing we record how much sleep did you get last night? How much water did you intake last night? What are you doing from a lifestyle standpoint? And we really harp on those things. And so my degree is in exercise science and physiology. And what people sometimes think is that you are building muscle when you're actually under stress or duress. Actually, you're not. You're actually building the muscle when you're resting and your sleep. That's when your muscles actually grow. They actually develop the most. That's when things absorb, when you are actually resting. And so that is such a huge aspect of what in terms of physical development. The same thing comes from a mental aspect. Like there was some I saw on Instagram recently where it said, when you're 30,000 feet in the air and you have nowhere to go and you're flying it in on an airplane, he says that increased altitude is increasing the oxygen uptake to your brain. And some of your best thoughts can come when you're on that plane and you don't have anywhere to go and you don't have Wi-Fi unless you paid for it, right? You don't have text service unless you're on a different airline, you pay for that service. And so that rest and recovery, that ability to do nothing well, is where some of your best ideas come from, because it gives you more of an objective lens. I give an example. So my business partner and mentor, when he wants to write a book, he'll get on it for 6 months straight, an hour a day, and he's on it. That doesn't work for me. I can work on something for 3 or 4 days straight, 2 or 3 hours a day, and not touch it for 3.5 weeks. And I feel zero guilt, because that time away from it gives me a chance to grow, to learn, to observe. And it gives me a chance to rest from it. And I come back with a more objective view, and I can add, delete, edit, omit, and what have you. And I don't think I would have that increased perspective if I did not pull away from it. And so part of the things that I do, I go out every morning for a walk. I go kayaking a lot, jet skis, things like this. Water is a calming aspect for me, and I get some of my best ideas. And so when I'm outside, I'm writing down notes in my phone. Like, okay, I haven't thought about this. So this could be a great idea for a video clip. That all comes with rest and recovery. And, from a spiritual standpoint, the man upstairs rested as well. So we should too.
Well said. That's awesome. Very wise points. All right. So I want to highlight this because you had mentioned three exercises: bench, squat, deadlift, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's what's fascinating to me. So I wrestled for 10 years. Okay. So for anyone listening, wrestling in the US is folk style wrestling. It's high school and colleges, it's folk style in the US, and in Europe, it's freestyle and stuff like that. And the Olympics does freestyle. But as you know, Will, with folk style wrestling, when you reach the peak, so when it comes to high school, when you are competing in the state championship, the individuals that get very high and they place within the top 10, that's within a couple points. And when I got to a lot of these different tournaments, I recognized that top bouts win by 2 points, and a single leg shot, so single leg takedown, is worth 2 points. So if you master takedowns you essentially, if you dominate with takedowns, you essentially could go very far in the wrestling world. The reason why I bring this up is because people might be listening to this thinking, well, I wanted to learn about the curls upside down. I wanted to learn about the fancy, crazy things. And now you're telling me there's 3 basic exercises? That doesn't sound fun. And what's amazing to me is like, it does go back to the basics. I was floored when I got to, now I never won the state championship, but I had gone to the tournament and I was able to see some of these wrestlers. I'm like, the ones that win are the ones that master the basics. If I could do my entire wrestling journey all over again, all I would have focused on was single leg shots or takedowns and stand ups, because when you stand up, you get a point as well. And in business, this is so important because sometimes, especially with AI technology coming out, the new flash, right? Everyone's going crazy. They're changing their business models and changing, we got to do this and that. And it's amazing the businesses that they cling to the flash that's coming out culturally, and they lose sight of what they're good at. So can you speak to, have you seen, and you don't need to name names or anything, you could speak in more general, but have you seen athletes that you watch them and you say, wow, they have so much potential, they're doing really good, and then for whatever reason they want to go the fancy route, or they want to do maybe a crazy trick play, and they lose focus, and then they're not able to gain back what they were good at? Have you ever seen something like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely, man. I'm actually watching this quarterback series on Netflix now, which is super interesting. I think it profiles Mahomes, Cousins, and Mariota, and the difference in how they approach the game and the basics is so stark in contrast. It is actually just almost like, I don't know, it's overwhelming just to see how different they approach the game, and you see why Pat Mahomes is at the top of his game, right? Just based on how he approaches it. I would say from my standpoint, and so I have one player that's in the NFL now. He signed like $100 million contract last year. And I'll never forget when we were in college at Baylor, he would get in trouble a lot for just doing little knucklehead things. And he would kind of just go with the crowd. Even though he was a different guy athletically and mentally, he just wanted to fit in sometimes. And so what we would do for punishment, we put him on the stair climber at the highest level for like 30 minutes. But we'd also bring him to the concession stand at the softball games and make him sell nachos. And so we make him work the concession stand. I think it was in that time that I really just saw who he was as a person. And I realized that the things he was doing was just because he wanted to be, in a sense, have a sense of community. And he didn't have that, right? Because of how good of an athlete he was and where he was from. And so he was like, well, I'll just go with the crowd because that's what they're doing. And I want to be accepted. I want to be a part of the team. And so we worked on those basic things about just how to be your own person, how to do the right things at a really high level. And like I said, he's, I got a $95 million contract now in the NFL. But I would say from what I've seen, even just in my own world, I've seen people, even from a speaking standpoint, they follow the trend. So if a new trend comes out, oh, do you talk about this? Oh, of course I talk about that, right? And that's not really even in your lane. And I've learned that you don't want to find a message that resonates with an audience. You want to find an audience that resonates with your message. And that's the biggest thing I think we can do, especially with all the kind of flash in the pan things are coming with AI, because honestly, we don't really know where it's going. We've seen the early aspects of it, but the twists and turns it's going to take. I mean, we have an automated McDonald's out here in Texas with no people in it, right? And so I think there is an aspect to where you understand what the landscape is doing. You understand what's out in the marketplace, but you also have to understand that we as a company have built it upon, these principles, and we have to stay true to who we are. And so what I do is I study a lot of brand history. Like I was reading the other day how Samsung used to be a grocery store and how FedEx almost went out of business. And a guy went to Vegas with $5,000 and gambled his way into saving the company. How Airbnb used to sell boxes of cereal in order to keep their business afloat. How WD-40 and Formula 409 are actually named after the number of attempts it took to get those formulas right. So 40 attempts for WD-40, 409 attempts for Formula 409. And so when I think about those aspects, I'm like, these companies stay true to the basics. If Formula 409 gives up an attempt 407 or 408, and let's just go do what Fabuloso's doing, right? Then they never are able to create that market segmentation or differentiation in the market. So I would say that sticking to the basics of what made us who we are is critically important, because there's always going to be something new that pops out. every single day. And last thing I'll say to that, I heard an analogy last night online. It says if you being in business is just like being in the gym. If you look to the right, you'll see someone that's in better shape than you that you would love to be in their shoes. But if you look to the left, you would see somebody that's struggling. They would kill to be in your shoes. So that's why I said we have to just stay the course and just keep cranking it out.
Wow. Okay. So let's talk about that. You had mentioned about an audience that finds your message. I'm guessing finding the message valuable, correct? So talk about your speaking when you go into organizations and you do a deep dive into a lot of what you learned when it comes to leadership. What are some of the key elements that you focus on?
Absolutely. I could say I could boil everything down to the power of connection, right? The shortest distance between two people is connection. And so how do we forge these connections? Because in today's marketplace and landscape, we are so connected that we're disconnected, right? So we have all these social media platforms, we have text messages, we have literally almost everything you can name. But I've learned that a like or a engagement or an impression will never replace a kind word, a hug, or a smile. And so when we talk about the basics, a lot of what I focus on is getting back to the basics. Because if you think about from an accounting standpoint, they have what you call generally accepted accounting principles, right? When I think about from a relationship building standpoint, they're generally accepted relationship building, aspects and standards. And so how do we get back to that? How do we get back to that power of connection to where we're reaching out to people? We're calling them on their birthdays. We're sending handwritten thank you notes. We're building great relationships. We're thinking about our first impressions. So first impressions, typically 4 to 7 seconds. How do we manage that effectively? What's our body language look like in terms of how we hold ourselves, how we stand, how we communicate? Are we listening to listen or are we listening to respond? Right. So these are the aspects I really focus a lot on, is taking a deep dive into those soft skills, because as we kind of hit on earlier, the future of work is really, you can look at, there's a few different aspects. So it's like what the work is, who's doing the work, and whether work gets done. Those are kind of the 3 W's of the future of work. And so what I've learned is that, the new generation, and it's even having a trickle up effect, they're focusing much more on, okay, how can we find meaning in what we're doing? No one wants to sit in the back of the cubicle with the lights off and just, crank away anymore. They want to be tied to the mission. They want to be tied to the purpose. And so in doing so, business leaders are charged with creating more connection, creating more community, and creating a sense of buy-in that they may not have had to do in the past, right? Because people are not sitting in jobs 30 to 40 years anymore and wait on their 401k or their pension to kick in. And so there's a different time now, and the business leaders that are focusing on the connection, on the mission and purpose, on the value-based rewards are really the ones that are going to crush it in the future. And so I try to spend a lot of time on seeing how we can better communicate and connect with our people so they feel a part of it and no one falls by the wayside. And as a result, their work doesn't teeter. And then another big thing is people want to be flexible now. They want to have more flexibility. Why is that? Because I read a study the other day from HubSpot. It says that remote workers are actually just as engaged, if not more, than in-office workers, right? And so there's a lot of changes that's coming on in the new frontier. But if we stay true to who we are, while being able to adopt some principles and some standards and ways of doing things, and really coalesce the two, I think that's the winning formula. Being aware of the future, but being able to stay in the present and somehow marry the two, I think is the sweet spot.
So you had mentioned so connected that we're disconnected. And people may be hearing that thinking, all right, well, what in the world do I do? And there's something simple that you had mentioned actually twice during our conversation that I want to pinpoint. You had mentioned the handwritten note that your coach gave you and what it meant to you. And then also you mentioned that's something that we can do to stay more connected. That is so powerful. And if my mom is listening to this episode, I'm sorry for making fun of you when I was younger, when you told me to write those handwritten thank you notes, because my mom really inspired me to do just what you had mentioned. She talked about the importance of taking literally 30 seconds and writing a handwritten thank you note. Well, I can't even tell you how much of an impact that's had, Will, when it comes to not only on my business, but in life. Just, I'm actually sitting next to a stack of thank you notes right now, and I try to write as many as I possibly can because, again, like no one's doing it. And that's the beauty. because no one's doing it. So if you get something in your mailbox that's handwritten, that's going to stick out versus a like or a comment on a social media platform. That is so important. You also mentioned something else that I want to talk about. You mentioned meaning in what they do. Okay. So I would say in the last decade, for better or worse, baby boomers and Gen Xers have made fun of millennials. And there is some things that they can point to that is funny, like, you know, your stereotypical millennial. And so there are some elements of, there is humor within that. Okay. Definitely material for jokes. But now the joke's kind of over in the sense that you have a massive wave of millennials coming to leadership positions across the United States. And now these baby boomers and Gen Xers are like, uh-oh, we want these people to do well for us. What do we do? And a big thing about that is it points back to what you said, Will, about the meaning in what they do, because at the top of every survey, millennials want to have an impact. So if you can paint and paint the scene for them through stories, right? Because stories really connect us, but also create this vibrant company culture that really empowers them to have an impact, businesses will be more successful. So I really appreciate you mentioning that.
No question about it, man. I totally agree with that. And we're going to see like a shift. There's a seismic shift that's happening right now that I think will go through probably 2025 or 2026. It's going to shape probably the next 20 to 30 years of business. And I think I've read something recently where it said some 60% of the jobs that will exist in 2030 have not yet been created today. Right. So upskilling and, you know, being better leaders. I mean, it's a huge topic of conversation now. So I'm glad you hit back on that because it's very much necessary.
So not only the stat that you just mentioned, but back it with that another billion people are going to be coming online globally by that point. And we are poised for an unbelievable amount of growth for individuals that really take what you've talked about today, Will, and actually do it. So I appreciate everything that you mentioned. I appreciate our conversation today. Thank you so much for your time. There's 3 takeaways that I'm going to take from our conversation. The first is I really appreciate you saying, keep the main thing the main thing. Sounds so simple, but in your field of football, that's what the greats have done. I mean, Vince Lombardi was the one that would hold up a football and say, gentlemen, this is a football, right? Sticking to that keep the main thing the main thing. And in addition, the second big takeaway is when you said that in these college football gyms, you're not seeing fancy exercises. You had mentioned bench, squat, and deadlift. And I think that's really important that as business leaders, we need to evaluate, do we have that squirrel mentality, right? Squirrel, and where we get so bombarded with just fancy things that are not propelling our business forward. We need to stick to the basics. In addition, the third and final piece that I'm going to take away is you mentioning we're so connected that we're disconnected. It's really important to think about, okay, here's what the masses are doing. Here's what everyone else is doing. What can I do that's different? You know, if no one sends handwritten thank you notes, that's awesome for you, for the one that actually does it. So I appreciate those 3 main points that you brought to our conversation today, Will. And if anyone wants to get more information on what you do, they want to invite you to come in and speak to the organization, where's the best place that they can go to get that information?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Matt, first and foremost, thank you for the conversation, the platform, and just the elite note taking. One thing we always say is elite people take notes and elite people want to be coached. And so I just love that aspect about you. As far as getting in contact with me, I'm on all social media platforms. At Will Baggett, that's 2 G's and 2 T's, LinkedIn as well. Email is will@execimage.org, and look forward to just continuing the conversation and seeing how I can learn and get better as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
Perfect. I will include that in the show notes. People can just click and go right to your site. But thanks again, Will. I very much appreciate your time today.
Pleasure was mine, Matt. Take care, buddy.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. Please leave a review, since positive reviews will make it easier for others to find this conversation. Next episode will launch on Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern. Until then, remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.